At this afternoon's session, we're going to start off with a heritage corn talk, and that's going to be brought to you by Dr. Margaret Smith. She's a professor at Cornell in plant breeding, working in corn. She's also an associate dean and director of the Cornell Agricultural Experiment Station. Margaret develops corn hybrids suited for organic production, and she is also one of the authors of an open pollinated corn, a descriptive catalog which gives detailed variety information. So, Margaret, please take it away.
Well, thanks very much, Christian. And I'm happy to see I wasn't the only one who didn't spend my lunch hour watching the safety videos, I think. So I didn't see too many hands go up, Christian. I don't know. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today on this, what is here, a beautiful afternoon. I'm sure many people would rather be outside because we actually have sun. But thank you for joining. I will share my presentation here, and hopefully you can see it. If you don't see it, will somebody please give me a shout?
You can see it.
Oh, hey, good. Thank you, Aaron. So I'm going to talk about heritage corn today, and I put just a couple pictures up there. As somebody already noted, that's Bloody Butcher over here on the right, a very beautiful heritage corn. And the one on the left is actually a picture of Iroquois White. So I'll be talking about several topics related to heritage corns. You can't sit at a land-grant university and talk about corn without acknowledging some of the debts we have. So I wanted to quickly put this acknowledgement on and read it for you. Cornell University's Ithaca campus is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayagono, the Cayuga Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. And we acknowledge the painful history of Gayagono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Gayagono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. I think that's particularly important because corn or maize is truly a gift to us that was shared from the original native peoples that occupied this land. So topics I want to talk about today, we're going to talk a little bit about where did corn come from. If we're talking about heritage corns, that's really about corns from the past. So I'll speak a bit about where corn came from, how heritage varieties were developed, and then I'll talk a little about what we know about heritage corn and its performance. So where did corn come from? This is really about the heritage of corn as a crop. It was domesticated in Mesoamerica, which is this area of Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, this Mexico and Central America right here. And its ancestor was a crop called teosinte. And if you look carefully, this is a Mexican cornfield on the bottom right here, and you can see plants that look like corn and plants that are corn. Some of the ones that look like corn are this one right here. You can see with these little spikes coming out of the leaf axils and little heads. This is what those look like, and that's actually a head of teosinte. And right in here, you can see some of the tiny little, very hard kernels that constitute the teosinte ear. And this over on the left here is a comparative picture, a modern day corn and a teosinte. And this thing probably has somewhere between 10 and 12 very small seeds with a completely indigestible seed coat on them that shatter and fall on the ground when they're mature. And to this day, I'm amazed that hunter-gatherers found it worth the trouble to collect these things and try them out as food, because if you can see that little tiny black seed there, by the time those fell and scattered all over the ground, finding them would be really difficult. They're smaller than peas, you know, so they're very little. So somewhere along the line, somebody figured out that it was worthwhile to try to use that thing as a food. Then they had to figure out that if you just eat it, it will simply pass right through your digestive system untouched because the seed coat is so hard that it's totally indigestible. So the hard seed coat, you have to somehow crack or grind it to get any nutrition from it. So somehow our ancestors, ancient agriculturalists, figured out that this was potentially a useful crop. And they selected it then for having more rows of kernels. They selected it for types that did not have that hard seed coat, and for what we call non-shattering, or making sure the kernels stick to the rachis or the cob once they're mature. So that is the process by which corn was first domesticated. once domesticated, the ancient ears of corn don't look quite as big and fancy as this, but they look a lot more like corn than teosinte if you look in archaeological sites. It was then the task of many, many farmers over many generations to do a lot of selection that achieved a whole array of things. Certainly, farmer selection achieved higher yields over time. Broad adaptation, everything from the highest altitudes of Mesoamerica down to the lowland tropics. Corn moved to Africa and was selected for adaptation to those environments, extremely dry environments, extremely wet environments, and often to the US Central Corn Belt as well. So farmers, as corn moved with those farmers, selected it for adaptation to different altitudes, latitudes, and a whole array of climates. And they also, of course, selected it for many different uses. So the different colors and grain types that you see portrayed here were types of corn selected by different peoples, different cultures in different parts of the world to fit their particular dietary needs, culinary preferences, and of course, adaptation to their many growing environments. So we owe a big debt of gratitude also to the farmer breeders who achieved all of this huge array of diversity. Their efforts are what gave rise to the vast diversity we now have available in our corn crop, particularly in some of those heritage varieties. If you just look at US #2 yellow dent, diversity is not the word that leaps to mind. But once you start looking beyond that, in some of the heritage varieties that I'll be talking about today, you do find this immense array of types, colors, grain textures, ear shapes and sizes, and flavors and qualities. So we owe a debt of gratitude for that level of diversity to the farmer breeders who achieved all that with no knowledge whatsoever of Mendel, genetics, or anything else by selecting the types that best fit their needs. I always think it's good at this moment to pause and acquire a little humility about who domesticated who. It's an interesting question. So we think of corn as this crop that cannot survive in nature. If you just throw a corn kernel out there, you can grow a plant, it'll make a nice ear maybe, but that ear has some husks, but there's nothing to defend it from a bird, a mouse, a raccoon, a deer eating it up. There's nothing really to defend it from molds destroying the kernels. And also, once that ear is mature, the whole thing falls to the ground at the base of the plant. If it doesn't get eaten or consumed or rot, you have 500 kernels that germinate in a space about this big, maybe 10 inches long. And the plants all out compete with each other and they die. So it has no good means of dispersal. So we say, look at that and say, corn can't survive in nature. Thank heavens for people. We're the ones that take care of it. Well, can you? I would argue that corn has really co-evolved. It's evolved quite elaborate mechanisms to take excellent advantage of dispersal by humans. So corn-human coevolution, look at it this way. We take care of the corn by carefully saving the seed. We collect the seeds before anything can rot them or before they get poor quality. We store them away safely. We prepare the land. We get rid of the weeds. We avoid all the competition with it. We protect it from insects and diseases. And we scare off birds or mammals or other things that might otherwise eat the corn. So corn has trained us to do all this, to take care of it. So who evolved? Who was domesticated and who wasn't? It's kind of a chicken and egg question. So who domesticated who suggests we should be a little bit humble. Corn doesn't survive in nature. We don't survive without our corn. It doesn't survive without us. It's a very co-evolutionary story. Okay, so much for the lesson in humility. I do want to talk now a bit about Northeastern heritage corns. So most of the corns that were originally long ago grown in this region were flint types of corn. And this little picture on the right here shows several different types of corn kernels. The one at the top is a typical dent. And you can see that in the center of the kernel is this soft, starchy endosperm. And then on the edges is this very hard, what we call corneous endosperm. It's much harder, it's kind of translucent. So as this dent type of kernel dries, the soft, starchy endosperm tends to shrink. It doesn't, as it loses water, it actually shrinks. whereas the hard endosperm has a much harder structure. So it can lose water, but the structure retains its shape. What that means is that, oh shoot, what that means is that I just skipped a slide. What that means is that as this corn kernel dries, the shrinkage of that soft endosperm causes a little depression in the top of the kernel, which is the dent of dent corn. Flints, which is this next row that you see down here, have some of that soft endosperm, but there's a full cap of really hard endosperm. So as this whole kernel dries, even if you have a little shrinkage inside here, the hard endosperm that encircles the top retains its shape. So flint kernels stay really round. They don't get that dent. I'm going to skip C here. D is what's called a flower kernel. There are certainly some heritage corns that are flowery types. And you can see that that's entirely soft endosperm. There's none of that hard translucent stuff. So the flower kernels do not tend to dent because the entire kernel shrinks, and it all shrinks sort of uniformly. So they tend to be big and round and rather opaque looking because of the flowery endosperm. The flint kernels are hard, but rather translucent looking because they have that translucent endosperm around them. So these flint types that were typical of the Northeast tend to have very long ears, 8 to 10 kernel rows. You've probably all heard of the 8-rowed flints. That was sort of the most typical type. They have a relatively thick cob. Because they were adapted here, they tend to be a little earlier maturing. That's of course relative. So relative to things that might fit well in the central corn belt, they're early maturing. And they also tend to tiller a lot. So a lot of branches from the base of the plant. You may get more than one full stalk, several full stalks on these flint type corns. There's a really nice book that my colleague Jane Mount Pleasant put together about the traditional corns of the Native Americans from this area, traditional Iroquois corn, history, cultivation, and use. So it's available from NRAISE, which is an organization that publishes a whole bunch of things relative to the Northeast and agriculture. So I would refer you to that if you're interested in the traditional corns. Since that time, the Europeans that arrived here learned from those Native Americans how to cultivate corn and began to select their own array of varieties that fit their needs. So this is a table from describing a bunch of collections that were actually made in the mid-1940s. And you can see they were, many of them, most of them from New York. There were a few from New Hampshire, a few from Maine. There's one from Massachusetts. But you can see lots of places you recognize here: Rochester, Newark Valley, Ithaca of all things, Potsdam, Bath, Dryden, New York, a couple collections. So these are some of the typical varieties: Canada Flint, Dutton, Harris Mammoth Yellow. Longfellow was pretty common. And you see Harris Mammoth Yellow and Mammoth Yellow. People often gave their names to their particular selection of a variety. Parker's Flint, Quebec Flint, Smutnose, that was a really common one. So this is just a real sampling. Sometimes they were just called 12-rowed red flint or 12-rowed yellow flint. So those were some of the varieties that were common in this area in the mid-1940s. One of the ones that's iconic is Reed's Yellow Dent, and I wanted to mention that. Reed's Yellow Dent was actually developed by a farmer originally from Ohio who took corn. He took both a northern flint, so you can see this flint, the hard, shiny, round kernels, the really long cobs. The cob is relatively thick compared to the amount of kernel on there. Darn. And then he also took a gourd seed type variety, and gourd seed was just a type of dent corn that tended to have very flat kernels. So you can see that the kernels on this are fairly thin in this up and down direction. They're sort of long, flat kernels. They looked a little bit like the seeds of a gourd. So these were called gourd seeds. So he took both of these. He moved from Ohio to Illinois, planted his gourd seed one year. And it turned out he planted it kind of late and it didn't grow all that well. So he wanted to fill in the spaces so he didn't have a lot of gaps and didn't lose a lot of corn to just empty space in the field. So he filled in the spaces with this northern flint, a yellow northern flint. Those then, of course, since they were in the same field, cross-pollinated. And the mix of those two, the northern flint and the gourd seed, is what gave rise to Reed's yellow dent, which has been one of the most iconic open pollinated varieties we have. It's in the ancestry of a lot of actually our modern day corn hybrids, and you can kind of see why. It looks a lot like standard US #2 yellow dent. So that's a corn that moved from probably the East Coast to Ohio to Illinois, where it was developed, and moved back then. And you find lots of selections of Reed's yellow dent from various places around the Northeast. It's one of the ones you can also still buy as a heritage corn variety and from various seed companies today. And there isn't that wide an array of choices. So I wanted to take a pause at this moment and just talk about all these things I've been talking about so far are open pollinated varieties. And I think it's always useful when we're thinking about heritage corns and how we want to grow or manage them to be aware of the difference between open pollinated varieties and hybrids. The one on the left here is Iroquois White, an open pollinated variety. The one on the right is just a hybrid. And I'm sure you can begin to see some of the differences just by looking at those two pictures. So an open pollinated variety is a variety where the pollen source, the source of pollen in the cornfield, is uncontrolled. You have a bunch of plants here, a mix of different genetic types. They all shed pollen. Pollen from any one plant in the field randomly pollinates the silks on those ears. And then you keep the ear from a plant, and it will give rise to a bunch of seeds. Each one is genetically different from every other one. So you can see the plants are a little bit, bigger, smaller, some probably higher yielding, some probably lower yielding. So each of those plants, bear in mind, is itself a hybrid. It's a cross between two different parents, because the silk that gave rise to that kernel was most likely not pollinated by the same plant that the tassel that shed the pollen was on. Corn pollen tends to drift on the breeze. And so when you have a tassel shedding pollen, whichever way the wind is going, the pollen will tend to kind of go angle off of the plant, and it will land on silks from a neighbor here. So every kernel on that ear is a product of this female parent and some random pollen grain from some other plant in the field. So what you end up with is a whole array, a mix of different hybrids that constitutes the open pollinated variety. Open pollinated varieties tend to be a bit variable. This is one called Painted Mountain. It was developed by a friend and colleague of mine in Montana. It's meant for extremely short season environments, so you can get it here. I'm not sure it would grow that well here. It tends to be very small and very early. But in an open pollinated variety, as I just said, every plant is a different hybrid from the rest of the ones around it. So it represents a cross between two different parents, just like your kids do, but each one is a different mix. You can save the seed from that mix because the seed itself was generated by random pollination among the plants in the field. You can save the ears and you still have a mix of seed that was generated by random pollination among those plants. Choosing which seed to save, however, will gradually change the variety. So in this variety, for example, if you happen to choose only the ears with the darkest kernels, over time, you would probably slowly eliminate a bunch of these lighter colored yellows and whites and other kernel colors you see in there. So your choice of what seed to save will affect the nature of the variety. This is why you find a variety like Reed's yellow dent, or like some of those, the mammoth flint that I was looking at earlier, where farmers would have given their name to their particular version of it. So Cusick Early Reed is going to be, it's from Reed's yellow dent, but it's going to be a little bit different from someone else's Reed's yellow dent because of the location, the environment, and the person doing the selecting. So in contrast to that, what's a hybrid? Well, a hybrid is plants that are grown from the seed of a cross between two different parents. So you can see here you have what we call inbred A, inbred B. You control pollination in a field. So you leave tassels on one of the inbreds, you remove them from the other. That means all of the seed on this ear right here represents this female mother parent and that distinct father parent. So the pollen comes from this one, the silks come from that one. The single cross hybrid seed will be hybrid. a cross between two different parents, but where every single seed is exactly the same hybrid. So hybrids often have better vigor, so larger size, earlier maturity, higher yield than the parents. This is a nice illustration of that. So in this picture, on the plants up here at the top, the two left-hand rows are the two inbred parents. The right-hand row is the cross between those two parents. So you can see how much more vigorous that is compared to its inbred parents. This is what the ears look like. So these are two inbred ears on the left. This is the ear you get if you grow the cross between those two as an F1 hybrid. So you can kind of see why people had an interest in hybrids. It gave you this greatly increased vigor, and that translated to more yield than you got from the parents. How do breeders go about making a hybrid? Well, you pollinate the plants with themselves until they're true breeding. So those would be called inbreds. You then make crosses between inbreds to form hybrids and try to figure out which of those are the best. And really the goal with this is to try to replicate over the whole field some of the best hybrids that were part of the mix of an open pollinated variety. So the open pollinated variety has better and less good plants. What you're trying to do is reliably duplicate the best plants over the whole field. And that's what gives you the benefit from a hybrid. Now, I didn't come to talk about hybrids, but I'll say just a few more things. So recall that, that the open pollinated variety that's pictured here is a mix of a whole bunch of different hybrids. The hybrid, every plant is genetically the same as every other one in the field. And you've all seen these kind of images, or you can see them as you drive around New York State. You'll see a cornfield where every ear is at exactly the same height and each one is exactly the same maturity and the tassels all look exactly the same. That is that genetic uniformity that you see in a single cross hybrid. Every plant is genetically the same as every other plant in that field. If you save seed from a hybrid, you're going to have varied and inferior performance. You're going to get back to something that looks worse than an open pollinated variety because you have a lot of inbreeding when you save a seed. Inbreds tend to be even smaller and less vigorous than a good open pollinated variety. So that's why you're not saving seed from hybrids. Now, this is a picture corn breeders love to show, and it shows over time from about the Civil War era all the way up. There are versions of this graph that go up till now, 2020. I just picked an earlier version, so this one goes to 1992. That tells you something about how long I've been kicking around in the corn breeding world. So it's the U.S. yield in bushels per acre from the mid-1800s to present. This is the era when most of what was grown was open pollinated varieties, and you can see yields did not really change. When we started growing double cross hybrids in the 1930s more extensively, and then single cross hybrids even more extensively, the yields went up, okay? So this was the attraction of the hybrids. This, as a breeder, breeders show this picture and they say, look at what genetics has done for corn yields in the US. I have to also acknowledge, if you're an agronomist and you show this picture, you're going to be saying, look at what improved management has done for corn yields in the US. Because of course, over this time frame from the early 1900s till now, lots of things changed in terms of crop management. We had more fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, better means. We got beyond the hoe for weed control, you know, more options for weed control, less problems from diseases and insects. Lots of management things changed, much higher plant densities. So rather than, 10,000 plants in an acre, we're up at closer to 30,000. So a lot of things changed. The honest view, not about putting on my breeder hat and saying this is all breeding or putting on an agronomy hat and saying this is all management. The honest assessment of that is that really it's the interaction between genetics and management. The plants get tailored to the management system in which they are grown. So having higher densities, for example, only works if you have a crop that is able to tolerate those high densities and still yield. These things become important because if you take a heritage variety that was developed at the time where they were maybe growing 10 or 15,000 plants to the acre, and you plant that thing at 28 or 30,000 plants to the acre, it's likely to completely lodge because it is not selected for and adapted to that amount, that level of plant density. So really how something performs is about the interaction between the genetics and the growing environment and the management system in which it's grown. If those two don't work together, you're not going to get productivity. And that's just as true for the old open pollinated corns as for the hybrids. Okay, so I want to transition now to talking about a project we did, and I think Christian mentioned this in the introduction, a project that led to that catalog of open pollinated corns, which I'll show you an image of at the end. This was a project funded by the Northeast Sustainable Ag Research and Education program, and it was an open pollinated corn evaluation. I did it jointly with my colleague Jane Mount Pleasant from here at Cornell and Stefan Seiter, who at the time was at the University of New Hampshire. So we had several reasons we argued that it was worth considering evaluating open pollinated corns. They do give people the option to control seed production. You can save your own seed of them. So you can therefore be able to tailor a little bit and take advantage of unique traits and adaptation to your own location and be independent of having to buy seed every year if that's an interest. Some of them have very unique traits. I started off this talk talking about the many different environments and uses and traits that farmers selected for. It gives you the option to really select your own version, just like those farmers back in the 1800s, people who developed like Hayes White or Weber's Mammoth corn, Mammoth Flint, you know, that you could give your own name to it. You can have Smith's Bloody Butcher if I wanted to select out of that Bloody Butcher that's pictured up there, make my own version of that with specific adaptation to particular traits and management, and maybe changes in color or changes in ear type. So there's the option to select your own version. And in some cases, the seed cost for open pollinated varieties, which is quite a bit lower than hybrid seed cost, may be worth it in terms of the returns. So these were some of the reasons we evaluated open pollinated varieties. Furthermore, there was very little data. I couldn't find essentially any data on relatively current performance evaluation. And the same variety can differ depending on the seed source. So you can have a version of Wapsie Valley, which is, I believe, what this is, that has a few red ears. You can have a version that has a lot of red ears. It depends on what the seed producer chose to select for when they were selecting and saving their seed. So the same variety sold by different people can have very different performance because it's been selected for different traits. So for all those reasons, we decided to do some evaluations. So our SARE Open Pollinated Corn project had two aspects. We did strip trials, so strips of the most promising open pollinated varieties based on some early assessments. We looked at those for grain yield and quality and also for silage yield and quality. You can see here just an example of what they looked like. We had a few commercial hybrids in there for controls. This was an open pollinated variety. Don't read much into the height of those. This was on a sloping patch of land, so it's not the best illustration. But what you do see is there's the hybrid with that tremendous uniformity, and here's the open pollinated variety with the bigger and smaller plants, the genetic variability I spoke about. We also did small plot trials, so 1/500th of an acre, which is really, it's 2 rows of corn that's about 20 feet long. We could test a lot more things in those. So we did small plot trials of a whole lot of open pollinated varieties, basically everything I could get my hands on that there was a commercial or a university seed source that was in sufficient quantity to be able to evaluate. And we evaluated those not for silage, but just for grain yield and moisture. And we looked a lot at plant type. So things like standability, whether it stood up well, plant height, so on and so forth. Now, the results I'm going to show you today are just a couple examples, because we could be here for another 45 minutes if I went through everything, and that would get me in trouble with Mark Sorrells because he's due next. So I'm just going to show a few of the results today, and they're going to focus on only the small plot trials. We had a total of 68 different open pollinated corns that we evaluated in those trials. 45 of them were what might be considered heritage varieties. And then 23 were more recently developed or recently improved versions of some of those heritage varieties. So 68 different open pollinated corns. Of the 6 that were most promising and that went into the strip trials, none of those included any of the heritage varieties. So that's why I'm not going to focus on that data right now. Basically, it was all the more recently developed new open pollinated varieties or the improved, dramatically improved versions of some of those heritage varieties that were most promising in terms of grain and silage production. So this was really focused on people interested not in unique quality so much as in grain and silage. So I'll show a couple tables for our small plot evaluations. This was grouped by maturity. So these were some of the later maturing varieties. And I've just chosen a subset of them, the more promising ones, to show you because the entire table of 68, as you could imagine, is pretty big. So this shows you grain yield, grain moisture at harvest, the ratio between those, which is really a measure of productivity. How productive is the plant given the maturity? So the earlier maturing things, if they yield the same as something later, will have a higher yield to moisture ratio. And then one of the things that's a classic challenge with heritage varieties is lodging. For whatever reason, they tend to lodge a lot. So over here is percent stalk and root lodging. The two ones highlighted in red are a couple commercial hybrids. So you'll recognize those names as things that look like commercial single cross hybrids. They are. So the first thing I'll call your attention to is true to form from what I've said earlier. These hybrids are much higher yielding than the open pollinated varieties. There was the closest thing here was the BSS, this big complicated name here. And that's an improved open pollinated variety developed at Iowa State University. This is the other BS that was the next thing in terms of yield, is one of the populations, open pollinated populations they developed there. But then you do begin to see, here's another BS, the next one. Then you begin to see some of the more heritage varieties like Trucker's Yellow, Reed, there's one of Reed's yellow dents, okay, that start to come in. The fact that it says low and high after this alludes back to what I was talking about the intersection between crop varieties and management. The real heritage varieties we planted at a somewhat lower density. So Beasley's Red, BD, Greenfield, Reeds, Buck Lance, Trucker's Yellow. These are heritage corns, and we put them at slightly lower density than the improved open pollinated ones or the hybrids, because they're just completely unadapted to those higher densities, and they really struggle to grow. They basically don't set any ears. So there was no point in trying to measure yield on something which doesn't even get to the point of setting an ear. So that's what the low and high means here. So first thing I'll call your attention to is that there's a big yield hit when you go from hybrids to even improved open pollinated varieties, these much improved ones. And then another hit when you go to the heritage varieties. Grain moisture, not too different across that range. We chose the hybrids to try and fit into this set of open pollinated varieties we were evaluating. You can see the yield for unit of maturity reflected in these yield to moisture ratios. The other thing I would call your attention to, I said at the beginning that we had challenges with stalk lodging. So these were sites where we had a lot of lodging anyway. That 17% is a lot of stalk lodging for a commercial hybrid variety, but the open pollinated ones were all considerably higher than that. So that tells you some of the challenges. I think among the non-hybrids, this Iowa State open pollinated material was the most promising one, but there were others that had interesting qualities in that. These are some of the early maturing varieties, and you can see a couple commercial hybrids there. Again, hybrids much higher yielding, but we do see Wapsi high density, which is a version of Wapsi Valley that was selected for adaptation to high density. Wapsi Valley is a recently developed open pollinated variety. You can see a couple other versions of it right up here in the table, and you notice their performance is somewhat different, okay? So as I said, depending on who's selecting and saving the seed, you get different performance. And here again is that Iowa State material, that open pollinated variety. So the recently developed materials are closest to the hybrids in terms of yield and tend to be better in terms of standability, although the Wapsi still has some challenges that way. But there were a number of other interesting ones that some of these are heritage varieties here: Early Butler, Wisconsin 25, Minnesota 13, Northwestern Dent, Golden Glow, one that looked pretty good. E95 I'll point out because E95 is a commercially available open pollinated variety. Wapsie Valley is also commercially available. So this is another one that was selected recently. And there's the reed yellow dent. Again, you can see here's another version of reed. Those two are pretty similar. And here's a third version of reed. So we had several different versions of reed, slightly different performance, not too much. They were actually all quite similar in this particular trial in terms of standability and in terms of yield. So what did we learn from this? Well, we learned that the heritage OPs don't compete with the recently developed open pollinated varieties in terms of agronomics and yield, and that none of those open pollinated varieties really compete agronomically with hybrids. Now, I recognize that most of the interest in open pollinated varieties tends not to be straight up agronomic and yield related interest. That said, there may be yield reductions that could be offset by inexpensive seed, especially if you have lower yield potential fields. The open pollinateds can be a good option there. I didn't talk about our silage strip trials, but there was some indication that silage use might be more promising than grain use, simply because some of the older open pollinated varieties tend to be very big and very bushy. They produce lots of above ground plant matter, so they could have sort of higher silage yields, and they do have some unique qualities. So really the key asset, that's what this brings me around to, the key asset that the heritage varieties and the open pollinated varieties in general offer is specialty grain quality features. So that's the thing to be looking at if you really want to think about heritage varieties, is what can they offer that's unique in terms of grain quality. I'm going to zoom through a little information about selecting and saving your own seed because a number of people are interested in that. And the open pollinated varieties and the heritage varieties are ones where you can do that. For a crop like corn, it's not as difficult as for some other crops where seed quality is just really hard to get decent seed quality in a humid environment like we have here in New York. With corn, it's possible. So I'll take a moment to talk about that. So what ears you pick will determine the genetics that continue in your variety, and they will affect the nature of the variety over generations. So you want to choose carefully the kinds of traits you want. If you're going to save seed, you need to save at least 100 ears. If not, in time, you're going to see inbreeding depression and the crop will just get weaker and weaker. You want to identify the best plants before harvest, and those would be plants that have full competition. They're not sort of standing off by themselves in an empty part of the field where, you know, they didn't have to deal with any competition, that are healthy and that have good standability. And then from those best plants, you're going to choose the best and the healthiest ears. So ears then have to be carefully dried. If you dry them at a temperature above 100, it will kill the seed. But you do want the seed moisture low to keep off the molds and reduce the chances of damage from insects who like more humid seeds. The seed has to be shelled and cleaned and then stored away from humidity, heat, and pests. It's always good to think about germination and purity tests because you don't really want to sow dead seed, nor do you really want to sow weed seed. So if you're saving your own seed, it's good to make sure that you're not creating problems for yourself the next season. And I'll just end that little seed selection piece by saying that producing clean, healthy, and high quality seed is definitely more complicated and much more labor intensive than producing grain that you're going to use off a crop. That said, as I said when I started the seed saving piece of this talk, corn is one of the crops where it really is possible to produce decent seed despite the humidity we often get during the harvest season. For a lot of other crops, and beans would be a great example, it's really hard because they just tend to get a lot of seed molds in them. So to close out, I love this little bulletin. Cornell had back in the early 1900s, the Cornell Reading Course for the Farm. So you can see that little header up here. Cornell Reading Course for the Farm. And this is President Wilson from 1917. Upon the farmers of this country in large measure rests the fate of the war and of the nations. So that was during World War I that was written. So this was lesson 129, improving the corn crop by selective breeding. And it really still goes through a lot of the principles I just talked about of how to save your own seed. So these are not new. This is not stuff that's a revelation in the last few years, but it's things people have been talking about for a long time. We did produce an evaluation with descriptions of all of those different open pollinated varieties, includes a lot of information about many of the heritage varieties we evaluated. And so this is just a shot of the cover. I believe that Aaron and Christian have a PDF copy of that that's available if anyone is interested. I also have it if anyone is interested. And a thanks to Jane Mount Pleasant and Stefan Seiter, as I mentioned earlier, who were the other contributors to that evaluation of heritage and open pollinated varieties. It's a good place to find a lot of description of ear colors, ear types, kernel characteristics. We were not able to do anything as complicated and intricate as evaluating, for example, cooking quality or organoleptic flavor traits and so on. So that we weren't able to do. But it's a good source of information comparing a bunch of different heritage and more recently developed open pollinated corns. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to the able management of Christian and Aaron for some questions if we have time, or to Mark Sorrells if we need to move right along.
Thank you, Margaret. We do have some time for some questions, and we have a number in the Q&A box. So I'm going to get started with those, and I'm going to try a little fancy feature here where the questions that were typed in can be answered live. So we'll start with the first one that came in, and that's from Sam Rose. Sam, can you...
Do you want me to read the questions or do you want people to ask them? I think I can see them here.
Okay, if you can see them here, I think it erased Sam's.
Oops,
so...
Sam just disappeared. So he's going to have to ask his because I didn't quite catch it before it went away.
You should be allowed to talk.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Thanks for taking my question and thanks for your talk. It was great. And this might be one that can't get answered at the moment, but any insight you have would be appreciated. I ended up bringing some corn back from Mexico, tortilla corn. There was like some artisanal tortillerías now that are working directly with farmers with heritage varieties. And then actually met Denise Kostic, and she took me down to Semite, and I ended up writing them later and getting some sent back from there, choosing for short season and maybe even like northern latitudes to see if I could get something that might work up here. I tried a little bit last year, but my season got cut short for other reasons. I'm just curious if you have any tips. Is it an impossible feat, or do you think there's certain ways that I could kind of push them towards adapting to this region?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thanks. So Denise Kostic is a good friend, and I used to work at Simit. So you were treading in my old territory there. The challenge with some of the corns from Mexico and from places further south is that not always, but often they are sensitive to photoperiod, which means that when they flower is a function of day length. So if you think about it, if you go to the extreme, to the equator, days and nights are always 12 hours. They don't change. Mexico, it's not quite like that, but you know, the day length when the corn is flowering might be not 12 hours, but maybe 13 hours. Here, by the time we get to 13-hour day length that would trigger flowering, it's like, you know, September. So that's a little late to get seed. You know, you can end up with your corn frosted before it even flowered. So one of the challenges is really getting it to the appropriate maturity and getting the day length sensitivity out of it. So when I used to bring things from Mexico, they would grow, like farmers always loved them at field days because they'd look across the breeding nursery with all this different stuff, and there would be something out there that was like 20 feet tall. It was enormous and huge amounts of leaves. And they would be like, I want that for silage. But what they didn't notice was that it hadn't yet flowered, you know, and that's kind of a problem if you want any energy in your silage, because you need grain in there too. So anyway, what I would do is I'd plant them out and then try to plant out a lot and try to look for plants that actually flower earliest. I also had my rule of thumb that if you know, when I stretch my arm completely up in the air, if I couldn't reach, not the tassel, but the ear I didn't pollinate it. So like I was pushing it to be a little shorter, which also relates to being less sensitive to the photo period. So there's a few classic problems that those corns coming from the subtropical areas like Mexico have. Photo period is one of them. So getting it to flower at a reasonable time. They tend to have trouble with standability roots. So the roots can be kind of easily, you can see a lot of lodging. And then they also tend to get smut. And it's not that there isn't smut here and smut in Mexico, but the nature of the smut population is a little bit different. So where they're okay down there, you bring them up here and they tend to be more susceptible to the particular population of smut we have here. So I'm sorry, that's a long answer, but that's a start. If you want to email me, I'd be happy to consult a little more about that.
Thanks, and that was great. All those things happened last year.
Yeah. Oh, I believe you. So I see, what is the smallest acreage a plot trial can be? Well, I guess the answer to that is the bigger the plot, the more accurately you'll get a sense of how well something performs, because you kind of encompass some of the field variation that it's bound to see. If you have a really small plot, I don't make mine any smaller than that 1/500th of an acre I told you about, 2 rows, 20 feet long. If you get smaller than that, you're really like, maybe the 3 plants you have happen to be in the place where the manure pile was and they look wonderful, but if you grow them over the whole field, they won't. I'm just going to pause and ask either Christian or Aaron. I see that it's 1:47. Should I type answers to the rest of these questions? I can do that.
We're going to 150, so you have a couple more minutes if you answer them quickly.
Oh, cool. All right, I'll stop yakking so much. Thank you, Aaron. I'll try to be fast. So I see Sarah, can you recommend a white corn for food or tortillas? I'm going to have to think about that, but I also see that Sam is working on answering that. It says Sam is typing an answer. I'll have to dig around. The tortilla corns mostly are adapted to areas further south with all those problems we just talked about. I see Timothy. What kind of seed planting rate do you recommend for South American yellow popcorn, a 1930s heritage? Heritage corn in general, certainly look at wherever you're getting the seed source. Sometimes people give you a recommended planting rate. So I would think about looking first there, but in the absence of any information there, I'd try 20,000, 16,000, something notably lower than current commercial corn densities. The difference between double cross and single cross hybrids, Jesse. Yes, I will say that very briefly. Email me if you have more questions, but basically a double cross hybrid is a cross between 2 single cross hybrids. The advantage it has is that the seed you're trying to produce to give or sell to farmers is produced not on a small, poor quality inbred ear, but the seed itself that you're marketing is produced on a hybrid. So seed yield is a lot higher. Safe distance for OP to avoid cross-pollination. Standard answer would be 660 feet, but it depends on the wind direction. It depends on hedgerows, and 660 feet is not 100% guarantee, even under the best of circumstances, but that keeps cross-pollination fairly low. Just remember that every open pollinated variety over time is the product of having mixed a little bit with whatever was around it. So cross-pollination featured prominently in the history and the evolution of heritage varieties as well. All that diversity came from somewhere, and farmers were able to select on it based on essentially genetic mixing that happened through cross-pollination with things that happened to be around in the neighborhood. That's like Reed's yellow dent. Accidental cross-pollination, not intentional, cross-pollination between a northern flint and a gourd seed from further south that happened in a farmer's field because he happened to plant both of them there. Questions again. How far apart would you suggest I plant Blue Jay, Double Red, and Mandan Bride to avoid cross-pollination? So if you're producing them in order to try to have those particular colors and you don't want it to get messed up, think about the wind direction, think about hedgerows and other things that would break up pollen flow, And then I would try to think about also flowering dates. If they flower at different, if they have different days to flower, that also helps you because time can also help to isolate them. And I would go with at least 660 feet. Oh man, oh, the questions just keep going.
And
Okay,
then Margaret, do you want to just
I'll type
type
some
those
answers.
out and we'll get Mark started here?
Yes, that's
All right.
fine.
Well, thank you very much, Margaret, and thank you very much for graciously agreeing to stay on and help answer people's questions that are coming in the Q&A box.